Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. My name is Stephen Menendian. I am the Research Director and Director of Research at UC Berkeley's Othering and Belonging Institute. I wish we could all be in person. This event was originally supposed to be live at the Marriott yesterday, but this is next best. Hopefully, this will be an intriguing, interesting, and engaging session. If you have questions, put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll try and get to them over the course of this presentation. So I'm here to talk about fair housing with a focus on the San Francisco Bay Area. I love talking with realtors. I did a presentation for the statewide association last year on this topic, and then I did a session for another group of realtors during Fair Housing Month in April. So it's great to be with you all in San Francisco, folks, here in what's really a balmy early October to talk about a very important subject, and a subject that's dear to my heart, which is fair housing. So to get grounded, I think what I'd like to do is start by drawing a distinction between affordable housing and fair housing. Now, it's not just folks in the Bay Area or California. It's really a national issue that people are talking about. How can we create more affordable housing? And this sometimes gets conflated with fair housing. So when state agencies or state entities talk about the need for affordable or fair housing, they may be talking about a particular type of housing, but when they use the term fair housing, not everyone knows what that means. So I guess I could do a poll, but just think in your mind, what is the difference between affordable and fair housing? Just think about that for a moment. Is fair housing a category that includes affordable housing, or is it something different? I guess if I had pre-planned the poll, I'd ask that right now. I'm going to suggest to you that affordable housing and fair housing are different concepts. So they're used interchangeably sometimes, but they're really quite distinct. Affordable housing basically refers to housing that's available to low-income people or very low-income people, people with limited means. And there's different types of affordable housing. So there's subsidized affordable housing. This is housing that can be demand or supply side. So supply side would be the low-income housing tax credit program, which is where the federal government provides tax credits to developers if a certain portion of the units in the development are set aside for low-income or very low-income people for a certain amount of time, maybe 50 or 99 years. Section 8 is a voucher program, also subsidized, but it's demand side. So the PHAs give renters a voucher, sometimes home seekers, to be able to afford homes because they have low income. So affordable housing, again, is about housing for low income people or very low income people, and it's either subsidized or it's what's called filtered housing. This is the term that urban demographers and sociologists use to describe housing that many years ago was at market rate, but because new developments have superseded them, it's filtered down the middle of the market and the lower part of the market. This is actually how the housing markets traditionally worked, is that, a building would be built in 1950, it'd be top of the market. A new building is built in 1960. The original building sort of filters to the middle niche, and then a new building is built in 1970, and those previous two buildings filter down to the next niche. That doesn't really happen anymore in America, at least in hot markets like San Francisco, for two reasons. One is that it's more valuable to landlords to do what's called upgrading. So if you have an older building that needs rehab, you can just spend a certain amount of money to rehab it, got the plumbing and you're all familiar with this more than I am. Put in new kitchen cabinets, et cetera, and then it can come back to the top of the market. But the other thing that's happened in the American housing market is that people like older houses now. There's this attraction. People want brownstones in Brooklyn and things like that. But there still is filtering in some neighborhoods. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Something that was just older housing stock that's now sort of the bottom of the market. Not as much on the coast, but that happens a lot in places like St. Louis or Columbus and so forth, where there's lots and lots of development and lots of older housing stock. But this is what is meant by affordable housing. Again, it's an economic concept. It's about housing that's available to low-income or very low-income people. Fair housing is actually about identity, not income. It's more about discrimination, segregation, and integration. And I'm going to explain that in more detail. So to summarize, affordable housing is an economic concept. Fair housing is a racial one or relates to protected identities. So before I describe sort of the history of fair housing, let's just go over some of the protected categories under fair housing laws. Under the federal fair housing law, which is the Fair Housing Act of 1968, there's 7 protected categories. These are categories that cannot be discriminated against in terms of sale, lease, rental, etc., credit in housing. Race, color, religion, sex, familial status, national origin, disability. Familial status was added in the 1988 amendments to the Federal Fair Housing Act, which really strengthened both the law itself and the enforcement apparatus. Now, fair housing law exists at different levels. There's federal fair housing laws, state fair housing laws, and local fair housing laws, ordinances that prohibit discrimination at the local level. California's housing law actually protects many more categories. I think it's actually up to 22. I count the fair housing statutes themselves at least 15, but they include, again, many of the same categories that are protected under federal law: race, color, religion, sex, familial status. But it also includes things like gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation, ancestry, even genetic information, and source of income. Source of income is really important. This means if you have a housing choice voucher, a landlord cannot discriminate against you on the basis of that. So that's sort of how fair housing, that's sort of the categories that fair housing law protects. Let me give you some terms before I get into sort of the origin of fair housing. So part of what fair housing is dealing with, as you can see, is not just economics. It's also trying to deal with our nation's history of segregation. So I'm going to use that term a lot, but I want to define it clearly what I mean by segregation. Now, segregation is simply the separation of people in any particular domain. It can be in housing, education, public accommodations, employment, occupation. Tesla was just sued, the company Tesla, the car manufacturer, because they segregated Black workers into sort of more menial departments. So in the Jim Crow South, it wasn't uncommon. The Black workers could only work certain jobs, like porters, janitors, etc. That's called occupational segregation. Public accommodation segregation would be where if you have a restaurant or public transit and people of different races can only sit in certain parts of a hotel or restaurant or a rail car. And I think we're more familiar with educational segregation. But segregation can happen anywhere. You can have it on any basis. You have gender segregation in schools or in swimming. You can have racial segregation. You have even religious segregation, which actually happens in India, where people of certain castes can't drink from water fountains or enter certain temples. So there's all sorts of forms of segregation. It's just the separation of people. And it doesn't have to be intentional. It can be, it doesn't have to be under law or policy. It can be a norm, a public norm that's enforced through a program or disapproval. Racial segregation, though, is the separation of people on the basis of race. And then racial residential segregation, or RRS, is the spatial separation of people in terms of housing on the basis of race. That's mostly what I'm going to be talking about here. I'm going to go through some measurements of segregation just so you can get a sense of how segregated the Bay Area is. There are a number of ways to measure racial residential segregation in America. Probably the most popular or widely used is called the dissimilarity index, which is a binary measure of segregation, meaning that it only looks at 2 racial groups simultaneously. It's scaled from 0 to 100. 100 would be complete segregation, and 0 would be complete integration. As of the 2020 census, the United States has a Black-white dissimilarity score of 55. This is very high. This means that America is a pretty segregated country. It means that 55% of Black Americans would have to move to a white neighborhood, or 55% of white Americans would have to move to a Black neighborhood to create perfect integration. And let me show you kind of how segregation, according to this measure, has changed over time. Contrary to the idea that sort of segregation was built in the 19th century, it was actually built in the 20th century. As you can see, segregation in America, Black-white racial residential segregation, actually peaks between 1950 and 1970. And when the Federal Fair Housing Act goes into effect, it begins to decline. But you'll notice that the rate of decline has slowed. So there's a massive decline between 1970 and 1980, less of a decline, less of a decline, less of a decline. So we're still at a pretty high level of segregation, generally speaking. This is the level of segregation in the Bay Area. The Bay Area actually has higher segregation, Black-white, as you can see here in 2020, 0.5742. than national. Shouldn't be surprising. You probably know that the Bay Area has lots of racially and ethnically identifiable neighborhoods where there are legacies of people who moved there and live there. So the Bay Area is a segregated place. And you can also see that these other forms of segregation, white Latino and white Asian segregation, have actually increased since 1970 overall. And so you get this level of segregation over here. I can answer questions about these later. I don't necessarily have time to go through all these in detail. I'm going to run very low on time, so I'm actually going to skip this slide, exposure index, which just shows you similar data. But I do want to show you this new measure of segregation called the divergence index. The divergence index measures multiple racial groups simultaneously instead of doing a binary, and it compares neighborhoods to the larger region. So if a larger region has a certain racial pattern, like 25% Asian, 25% Latino, 25% white, 25% Black, but a neighborhood, let's say, is 50% Black and 50% white, that will diverge from the overall region and it will show up as highly segregated. We released a study in 2020 that found that according to this measure, nationally, 54% of metro regions in the country were more segregated in 2020 than they were in 1990. And 23% more than 2020 than in 2010. So in some sense, the United States is becoming more segregated when we look holistically at all the different racial groups. We also found that to be true in the Bay Area. 7 of the 9 counties in the Bay Area have a higher divergence index score in 2020 than they did in 1980 or 1990. And in fact, Marin, it's gone way up. So this is a complicated graph to read. I realize these charts look like pipe cleaners, but the blue pipe cleaner here is the measure of segregation for Marin County. And you can see that since 1970, it's become more and more segregated. It's the most segregated county in the Bay Area. The 2 counties that have actually had declines are San Francisco, which is slightly below what it was in 1970, and I believe Contra Costa County. No, not Contra Costa County, sorry. Let me see. Alameda County is more segregated. Contra Costa County is more segregated. It is San Francisco and it looks like they're all more segregated except for one. So I'm mistaken. Just San Francisco, unless I'm misreading these quickly, is less, has had some decline in segregation. Contra Costa County has declined since 2010, but it's still higher than it was in 1970. Oh, Alameda County is actually slightly higher as well. So only one county actually has declined. This is what a segregation map looks like. So this is the county and city of San Francisco, sort of what I was just describing in terms of divergence. The pie chart in the upper left-hand corner shows you the racial demographics of the city and county as of, I believe this is 2019. So San Francisco County is only 40% white. It's declined to 5% Black. But you'll notice that these neighborhoods, these census tracts that are shaded in yellow, are over 75% white. And there's 22 census tracts in San Francisco that are over 75% white. Again, 75% white in a county and a city that's only 40% white. That's extremely divergent. And think about what that means for schools. So the schools that sit in the catchment zones here are also going to be segregated. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have an overrepresentation or a community, but if it results in unequal educational opportunity or distribution of jobs or other resources, then it's very harmful. And so you can see the Chinatowns here that are predominantly Asian. There are 4 tracts that are over 75% Asian. And then down here in Bayview Hunters Point, you can see tracts, despite Black San Franciscans only accounting for 5% of the population, you can see these tracts, at least in 2010 and 2019, were over 50% Black. I believe they're now under 50% Black, but were highly segregated and remain highly segregated. And also the underlying tracts, you can see the darker tracts are highly segregated because they diverge from the county, and the lighter tracts are the most integrated. So San Francisco, despite it being this beautiful city, a wonderful place, progressive values, is, like much of America, a segregated city. It's a place that has segregated schools, unequal educational opportunity, and segregated neighborhoods. And I'm sure as realtors, you can identify the racial or ethnic composition of these neighborhoods and the effects that they have. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical evolution of racial residential segregation. How did we get to this place? What was the role of realtors in creating segregation? So I'm going to speak very broadly, but there have basically been four phases to the evolution of racial residential segregation in the United States. The first is sort of the creation of segregation, which in the Bay Area, but also nationally, starts in the 19th century. And particularly in the Bay Area and San Francisco, there were a number of anti-Chinese laws. So there were laws that were passed that restricted where Chinese Americans or Chinese immigrants could live, and restricted the kinds of jobs they could do. And there were xenophobic, anti-immigrant demagogues that were actually politically powerful in San Francisco. But the first mechanism is what's called racial zoning. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The second mechanism is really where the local real estate industry era picks up, and the creation of real estate industry associations. And the primary mechanism here is racial covenants. And then from 1930 to 1970, this is when the federal government gets involved. And the primary mechanisms here are redlining and then segregated public housing. So you notice each phase has a different mechanism, and different levels of different participants are involved in each of these. And then since 1970, the primary mechanism for maintaining racial residential segregation is municipal zoning and land use authority. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Let's start at the beginning. So in 1880, in the 19th century, San Francisco adopted an ordinance that banned laundries in white neighborhoods. And this was superficially race neutral, but it was targeted at Chinese laundromats. And so the United States Supreme Court saw through this ordinance, and they struck it down in a major case called Gikwo. But the city tried again, and it adopted an ordinance called the Bingham Ordinance in 1890. And this went even further than just regulating laundries. It attempted to exclude Chinese residents from certain white neighborhoods. It basically said that Chinese residents could not live in or move into white neighborhoods. This law was also struck down by a federal court. And I should mention that the person who was involved in this, his last name was Kearney. I do not believe that Kearney Street is named after this person. He's a demagogue. He was also responsible for pushing the federal anti-Chinese Chinese Exclusion Act through local representatives in Congress. So these laws were early racial zoning laws. In fact, I think it's fair to say the Bingham Ordinance might be the first racial zoning law in the country, in the sense that it tries to demarcate where people of certain races can live or not live. But the first to do it in a comprehensive way is Baltimore in 1910. And what the city did was it divided the city into racial districts and said that different races can only live in specific districts. That's what makes it comprehensive. Covered the city and covered all the races. And then quickly thereafter, many other cities adopted these racial zoning ordinances, mostly southern cities. However, in 1917, in a case called Buchanan versus Worley, the Supreme Court struck down these racial zoning ordinances as unconstitutional. And interestingly, unlike the earlier federal courts, the Supreme Court didn't say that these racial zoning ordinances were unconstitutional because they were discriminatory. Rather, they said they were unconstitutional because they deprived white property owners of the right to dispose of their property as they wished. So it was a property rights argument against these laws, not a discrimination or equal protection argument. The second wave, though, is racially restrictive covenants. Many people use the term redlining in a general way, and they're actually conflating redlining with other mechanisms like racially restrictive covenants. You're all familiar with CC&Rs. Racially restrictive covenants were simply covenants that were put into the deeds or into the developments that specified that people of certain races, ethnicities, or religions could not buy or sell property, could not purchase properties in those developments. And this became much more popular once you had large-scale suburban developers begin buying large tracts of land and building dozens or many dozens of homes simultaneously. And this was viewed as more popular than deed restrictions because it was a collective action problem. So if you built a neighborhood and one neighbor wanted to make sure they lived in an all-white neighborhood, they could enforce and sue through the CC&R, right, any potential would-be seller against a Black or an Asian or a Muslim or a Jewish would-be entrant. And there were many, many racially restrictive covenants all over the country. The one problem is we don't actually know how widespread they were. It takes a lot of research to go back through the public records and find the CC&Rs. They're called large-scale demonstration projects. And these are research projects with many researchers who pull the records and study parcel by parcel whether a property had a racially restrictive covenant. And these projects are underway in Minneapolis, in Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Seattle. But no one has really launched a big one in the Bay Area yet. So in Minneapolis, they found over 30,000 parcels that had racially restrictive covenants on them, properties. And we just don't know in the Bay Area whether there were 3,000 in Contra Costa County, for example, or 10,000. And California last year adopted a law that allows homeowners that have these restricted covenants, which are void and unenforceable, but they're still in paperwork, to have them scrubbed out. And each county recorder's office is now working with homeowners if they petition to get that language removed. But that only makes the research harder to try and figure out exactly how many properties have these, because you have to go right in the county recorder's office, the chain of custody back to the original language. The point, though, is that racially restricted covenants may have been, aside from just blatant discrimination, the most powerful mechanism that created racial residential segregation in America, because they were so widespread and because they were so legally powerful. It wasn't until 1948 that the Supreme Court said that they were unenforceable. And they played a large role in the Bay Area. So Duncan McDuffie and J.C. Nichols, who were realtor developers that sought to create high-end subdivisions, they actually adopted restrictive covenants in the Bay Area in the early 20th century. But the earliest ones appear to have arisen in places like Los Angeles in 1905. And some sociologists and urban demographers claim that they covered tens of thousands of parcels. Again, we just don't know with precision. The California Supreme Court upheld them in 1919. Like I said, some of these projects have found many, many thousands of them. But in 1948, the United States Supreme Court, in a very important case called Shelley versus Kramer, held that racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable. And ever since then, they've been pretty much unenforceable, but they were on the books. And it meant that between 1910 and 1950, roughly, when suburbia was being initially constructed, restrictive covenants were widespread. So it meant that sort of Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, many other Americans could not move into white neighborhoods. And again, I mentioned this, but the real estate industry played a very large role in promulgating these instruments, claiming that restrictive covenants would help maintain and maximize property values. So here's a map from one of the demonstration projects called Mapping Prejudice in Minneapolis. And you can see just how widespread the restrictive covenants were in the Twin Cities area. And you'll notice that they're not in downtown Minneapolis, but in the suburbs and the rings around. So they were very widespread. Okay, this next mechanism, which I'm sure you've heard, is redlining. And again, in my opinion, restrictive covenants probably played a larger role in creating segregation than redlining. Redlining simply came too late. And as you saw from the charts I had earlier, segregation rose very rapidly in the early decades of the 20th century. Redlining came too late because it came in the 1930s and really took off in the 40s and 50s. So I'm going to go through this quickly. I'm also way behind on time. So I'm going to have to move quickly. I'm sorry. Redlining is simply a government ranking system that was used by private industry to designate the quality of neighborhoods and to designate credit risk. And every neighborhood was surveyed by surveyors who fanned out across American cities and ranked neighborhoods A, B, C, or D with color coding them. And this happened in more than 200 cities that we know of. These are all digitized, the ones that exist. And it was done by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a Depression-era agency that was created to try and prevent foreclosures during the Depression. But really, it was adopted by the Federal Housing Administration, late 1930s, 1940s, that then affected the whole private market. And you've probably seen these redlining maps. Again, not every city has one because not every city was built out by 35, 36, 37, 36 when the I think the homeowners loan corporation ran from 1933 to 1937 roughly. But there are many of these, and there is a long tail to this. We know that by looking at these maps, we can see present day effects in terms of health, in terms of child outcomes, in terms of employment, et cetera. Researchers are still using these maps 90 years later to study their effects. And this was an important mechanism in deepening and extending segregation, which had already been built out in the first 40 years of the 20th century. Here's another redlining map of Milwaukee. Again, there are over 200 of these that you can find. But I'm just running so low on time. I'm so sorry. I'm going to speed through this because I don't have time. Okay, so I do want to mention that in the present era, one of the ways that segregation is maintained is by zoning laws and other land use laws that are ostensibly designed to keep out separate uses. So you don't want like a factory belching smoke and other toxins next to a school or a residential neighborhood. So that's the idea of use zoning. And Berkeley pioneered a form of use zoning called single family zoning. In 1916 was the first city in the country to do this. And then this practice was upheld in a case called Euclid by the Supreme Court in, I believe, 1920 something. And then it spread like wildfire, such that about 10 years later, by the mid 1930s, about half the country, about 80% of the municipalities had use zoning. But what's happened since then is that use zoning has turned into fiscal zoning. This is where municipalities will zone not to keep out separate uses, right, to prevent nuisances, but really to maintain and maximize property values. So when a city says, a lot has to be an acre, or a city says you need to have a certain amount of setbacks and green space on a property, it's really an anti-density zoning law that's designed to maximize the property value and make sure that low-income people, or even middle-income people in some cities, can't afford to move in there. And this is designed not only to maximize property values, but also to protect the tax base, right? Where the cities say, we want to make sure this property maintains its value so we get the revenue that we need to pay for sewer, water, infrastructure, schools, services, et cetera, et cetera. This has an incredibly exclusionary effect, and we've studied it, and you can find some of my research on the web. This basically allows municipalities to select their own residents rather than the other way around. And it keeps out lower income people and therefore really prevents children from having access to high opportunity neighborhoods and high opportunity schools. Not only is this fiscal zoning and this kind of anti-density zoning widespread, but it's combined with down zoning. So around the early 1970s, cities began these neighborhood preservation ordinances that would prevent density. And Berkeley, again, was one of the first to do it. I'm moving quickly here because I'm running really low on time, so forgive me. I want to return, now that you understand, hopefully, how segregation was built and how it is maintained. I want to go back to the original question about what is fair housing, where did it come from, and how does it relate to affordable housing? So the term fair housing is actually a historical artifact. And it came out of what was called the open housing movement of the middle decades of the 20th century. So what was the open housing movement? Well, after World War II, you had millions of GIs, servicemen, returning to the United States and wanting to buy homes, form families, and so on and so forth. And many of them were able to take advantage of the GI Bill to get discounted homes and so on. But Black GIs who returned couldn't because of restrictive covenants, because of redlining. They could get a loan. Even if they could get a loan, they couldn't purchase a home in a new suburb or a new development. So it made a lot of people angry. And there was, in the wake of World War II, a lot of crowding in major cities because there just wasn't enough housing. So there's a book by Thomas Sugrue called The Origins of Urban Crisis about Detroit. There's a book by Arnold Hirsch called The Second City, a Second Ghetto, about the same phenomenon in Chicago. So the open housing movement was an early civil rights movement that called for neighborhoods and cities to adopt ordinances that would open up neighborhoods that were exclusionary and wouldn't let Black and other ethnic and racial and religious minorities move into those neighborhoods. And that was the header for it. this open housing movement. And so they demanded what were called open occupancy laws that would prohibit discrimination. And by the 1950s, this movement was sufficiently advanced that many jurisdictions in major metropolitan areas were actively considering the adoption of these laws. They didn't get very far, though. So, for example, in I think it was St. Paul, Minnesota here, it might have been Madison, there was a Black alderwoman or city councilwoman who proposed one of these bills, these ordinances, and she was the only one in favor of it. And so it was defeated, I think it was 15-1 or 14-1. But you had civil rights groups and neighborhood organizations that were pushing for these laws, these open occupancy laws. And so they were being debated in places like Madison and Seattle and Chicago and St. Paul and so forth. But they really weren't adopted yet. And the reason was twofold. Number one is ordinary Americans generally oppose these laws. They believe that people should have property rights to dispose of their property however they like, and that anti-discrimination laws forced them to sell to people they didn't want to sell. They called it forced housing. So it was a property rights argument. But even more important than general American sentiment was the role of the real estate industry at every level: local realtor associations, state realtor associations, and the National Real Estate Association boards basically organized in opposition of these open occupancy laws. Wherever they popped up, they would lobby against the adoption of them. And they played a very prominent role. So I actually had a researcher earlier this year pull all of the statutes that were adopted, these open housing laws, between the 1950s, really 1958, and the Federal Fair Housing Act in 1968. And you can kind of see the pattern here. So the first state to adopt an open housing law was Colorado in 1959. And the first city to adopt an open housing ordinance, it was a very weak one, was New York City. And its original formulation had only protected against discrimination in public housing. It did not cover private owner-occupied housing. But other cities followed suit. And until you built a critical mass of states and cities. By 1968, when the Federal Fair Housing Act was finally adopted, about half the states in the country had an open housing law, an open occupancy law. And you can see that there were second versions of these across some states as they strengthened and removed loopholes, increased the penalties, increased the fines, strengthened the enforcement, architecture, and so on and so forth. So, and I also just compiled this chart. The chart goes up, the previous chart goes on, but you can also see that they were adopted in off-election years because these were, by and large, as I mentioned, unpopular. Americans, particularly white Americans, did not like these laws. And in fact, they were so unpopular that when California finally adopted a statewide open housing law in 1963, the voters overturned that in 1964 by Proposition 14, a ballot initiative, which I will mention again in a moment. So when these things did get on the books, they got on the books generally in off-election years. And you could also see there was a general momentum, right? The general momentum was built up such that you had 12 of these ordinances adopted at the local level in 1963. And then in subsequent years, the states began adopting these. So I've already mentioned a lot of this. I mentioned the Rumsford Fair Housing Act. Okay, in 1968, we have Federal Fair Housing Law. And this sort of is the culmination or the capstone of the open housing movement. But why is it called fair housing? Well, the reason it's called fair housing is because open housing advocates felt that the term fair housing was a more neutral and moral way of calling for these laws, especially when the opposition argued that fair housing, or open housing rather, was forced housing. So it was just sort of like how we have these euphemisms. So one of the major political parties likes to call the estate tax the death tax, just another way of framing the policy. But fair housing is now how we refer to these laws, even though they were an early byproduct of the open housing movement of the 1950s and 60s. So let me turn to how California responded to some of these laws. Now, California has a long history of adopting racist ballot initiatives. That is the people of California. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will mention, as I mentioned before, Proposition 14, which nullified the Rumsford Fair Housing Act and thereby allowed open and legal housing discrimination. these are just some of the adoption of propositions that probably one of the most famous or well-known now ballot initiatives that has racial effects. It's not explicitly racial, is known as Article 34. I would ask you if you're in the room to raise your hand if you've heard of this, but I'm not there with you personally. But this is a ballot initiative that's now part of the California Constitution that requires local voters to authorize publicly funded low rent housing in their neighborhood. So it forms a barrier or a hurdle to creating affordable housing. I think we're going to try and get rid of this in the next major election in California to overturn Article 34, which was originally Prop 10. These are just more, yeah, so in 2024, California voters will be asked to repeal Article 34. What is the role of realtors in all of this? Well, the real estate industry played a critical role in many of these developments. So as CREA, NARAB, and the Los Angeles Realty Board, now CAR, NAR, and Beverly Hills Greater Los Angeles Association of Realtors, played a critical role in particular in promoting and trying to sell the benefits of racially restrictive covenants. So realtors worked hand in hand with neighborhood associations, developers, and local municipal authorities to try and persuade developers to use racially restrictive covenants and to get municipalities to mandate them. They also advised on redlining and exclusionary zoning, and they played a critical role in many of those ballot initiatives. So CREA actually played a huge role in boosting and supporting Proposition 14 to overturn the Rumsfeld Fair Housing Act. And they were a leading role in that campaign. Again, arguing that these ordinances and statutes were forced housing, violated freedom of association and property rights. So what is fair housing? Well, the Fair Housing Act, is basically an artifact of, again, the open housing movement. And so the legislative history said that the goal was to replace segregated ghettos, quote unquote, the term they used, with balanced and integrated living patterns. That is what the goal was. It was to create residential integration after our cities, our neighborhood associations, our real estate industry had built segregation into the American neighborhood fabric, a fabric that we still live with today. So this is very important. Fair housing is about segregation, integration, and discrimination. Affordable housing is about income and housing that's affordable to very low and low income people. It's an economic basis. So what are the effects of this? Well, let me give you a few statistics and I'll wrap up. Well, one of the effects is that we have a massive racial disparity because of intergenerational wealth accumulated in the post-war period in homeownership by race. So the United States recently has about 66% of Americans own their own home. But for white Americans, that figure is about 75%. For Black Americans, that figure is only about 44%. So it's about a 30 percentage point disparity, a huge disparity in home ownership in America that's masked by this 2/3 of people who own their own home. And this disparity has gotten worse, not better over time, right? So if you look in 1970, the disparity was only 24 points. In 2020, it's a 30-point difference. This is getting worse, not better. If we look at California, the phenomena is even worse. In 2019, which is the most recent year I could get the data, 55% of Californians own their own home. Of that, 63% of Californians own their home, but just 36% of Black Californians own their own home. And that disparity, again, is much larger than it was in 1970. It's a 27% disparity. And in fact, the percentage of Black Californians that own their own home has basically gone down, right? From 39% and 40% in 1970 and 80 to 36% today. So this is the situation that we're at. And if you want to read more about my research on segregation or see more maps, I have a map for every county in the Bay Area, just like the one I showed you on San Francisco. Just Google racial segregation in the San Francisco Bay Area, and you'll see our series. And just click part 1, and you can see all the maps in there. Or if you want to see some demographic charts by race, scroll down to part 2, and you can see that. Now I'm happy to take your questions. I hope this was interesting. And I think also the other thing I just want to leave with you with is that realtors play a very important role here in helping realize our vision of a more equal opportunity society and a more integrated society than the one we currently live in. So I thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to talking with you. If you have questions, just paste it in the chat. I wanted to make sure I had plenty of time for Q&A. Does the host have any questions? Anything they think that the members should know?
Hey, Stephen. Oh, it looks like someone just typed a question in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind words. Appreciate it. I wish we were in person so I could see and thank you. Go ahead. Go ahead with the question.
It looks like they just said thank you so much for your great presentation. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to type in the chat or the Q&A box. Okay, so we have one question. It says, the county wants to put large affordable projects in towns. Does Article 34 not allow this without voter majority?
If there's publicly funded components to it, that is generally correct, yes. Article 34 will require a local vote, is my understanding. I'm not an expert in Article 34, but I believe that is correct. And again, the other condition is that there has to be low income, right? It's low income restricted units as part of it. But basically that's correct, yes. It's a huge barrier to creating affordable housing in California, which is why next year it's going to be very important. I don't know that I can ask people to support a ballot initiative, but I will just say that the policy principle behind it will be very important to deal with. Article 34 is a significant barrier in California, and it's a vestige, right? It's from 1950. It's a vestige of a hopefully more, hopefully we've become a little bit more progressive in terms and enlightened in terms of understanding the importance of racial equity and racial equality. Yeah, I don't know exactly what the loopholes around Article 34 are, but I think there may be a difference there in terms of sort of like permanence. And it may also have to do with construction rather than sort of conversion. So the question, Norman, you asked is, yep, state funding have allowed homeless to live in converted hotels. So there might be a difference between conversion and construction.
Okay, great. Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Well, if you'd like to know anything else, you can email me. You can find my email address, smenendian@berkeley.edu. I'm generally responsive. It's been an honor. I love talking with realtors. I think you do really important work. And almost all of you I've met are really oriented in terms of wanting to do the right thing. I know you have a hard job right now. I know that the market is tough. I don't know. I've been told when I was down in San Jose, they said they were doing fine despite high interest rates. But I imagine business is probably difficult. So I wish you the best. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to share the history of fair housing with you, to talk about racial residential segregation, and just, plant that seed on the role that realtors can play to try and create a more integrated and fair, racially equitable society. So again, thank you very much and good luck to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everyone.